there's one important story that I want to get, because I was very moved when Tim told me the story of his Latin at Assumption College, and I'd love to, for the rest of our family to get hear that story about George.
It's a story because in those days at Assumption, they weren't particularly sensitive to one's feelings, and you were graded in classes according to your academic expectations. And so the higher you went in the alphabet, the lower you were in the academic ranking. So I remember that I was in 10E and 11D. And this was sort of, and it was even said at times in class, one can't expect too much of you in this class. So anyway, for that might have been a factor that because Father Thompson was a very demanding and excellent teacher of Latin, but very demanding. It may have been studiedly that he was not put in charge of the lower classes. And so I didn't have him. The whole way through grade 12, I didn't have him. And I ended up, because I actually started working in grade 11 and got to the head of the class, I ended up being promoted to 12A for my last year, but I still didn't have him for whatever reason, just the luck of the draw, I guess. So the Latin teacher I had for I think all of 5 years, or at least most of 5 years, was a Basilian whom we called Cheery O'Leary. And the poor man was past his best before date as a high school teacher. As a matter of fact, looking back on it, I think he was really clinically depressed. He would come in sometimes in a very, very dark mood and would simply say, open your books and do this lesson, and then he would sit and look out the window for the whole time.
Wow.
And it was one of those cases where after a few exams you get the impression that what you write on the exams doesn't matter because you've been slotted into a certain mark, and the marks have a certain consistency whatever you put on the paper.
Wow.
So I don't think he was spending too much time on marking papers. And he didn't have very high expectations or demands for us to learn very much Latin, and yet I would get my C. And I was not a language person. I liked neither Latin nor French. And as it turned out, this turned out to have a rather ironic outcome, because I then proceeded to have to learn about 4 languages subsequently in my life. And but at that time, I mean, I liked history and I liked chemistry, but I just didn't like languages. So the fact that I wasn't learning very much Latin and I was getting by with a C or whatever I was getting was quite all right with me. Well, it was all right with me until I got to grade 12 and decided that I was going to go to St. Peter's. And St. Peter's at the time, you had to have grade 13 and you had to have French and Latin. So suddenly I had to go into grade 13, and I had to, at that time, they were considered 2 subjects, right? Literature and grammar, in French, Latin, English. So I ended up having to take grade 13 French and Latin. Neither one of which I was going to be very competent in, but particularly in Latin, I did not know very much. So I registered and they slotted us in, but the scheduling was that they expected not too many students to be taking these most desirable subjects. So they had scheduled Latin and French for 13 at the same time. So first complication, there were two of us. I think the other fellow was thinking of the seminary. I don't think he ever went. I can't remember his name now. Anyway, two of us ended up registering for both Latin and French. So that was a bit of an impasse. And the second thing was, only two of us registered for both. So here were these poor profs. The French prof was Father Fournier.
Oh, yeah.
And he was quite demanding, but I had had him before, and we sort of managed to get along, not having great mutual expectations of one another, and getting by. So what they did, I mean, when I look back on it, you know, the generosity of those days. I mean, number one, Father Thompson taught the whole grade 13 Latin course for 2 students. And Father Fournier, because he had French at the same time, retaught during his spare grade 13, so that we wouldn't be deprived of being able to get both French and Latin. Well, then we got in and we started Latin, and I think it was perhaps the first day or very early on. Father Thompson said to me, "We have an awful lot of work to do," because they were departmental exams and they were very demanding.
Yeah.
And I was basically going to have to get 5 years in one, and that was evident to both of us. He was known to be an absolute master of Latin, and he was known to be very demanding, and he was known to have expectations that you would learn Latin one way or the other. Anyway, because of the circumstances in which I encountered him, I found him, and I'd always thought during my years, am I ever lucky, you know, because I haven't had to deal with these high expectations and these high demands. I got away with it,
Yeah.
they say. Well, then in grade 13, I can't get away with it anymore, and I really need it. But because it's basically a private tutoring situation, and he could see that I knew it was a big challenge, and he knew it was a big challenge, and we agreed it was a big challenge, he was the absolute epitome of patience and sensitivity with me. Now, I mean, I really had to work like 2 hours a night the whole year. But we did it, and it wasn't even a pass. I mean, I got B's or C's, I can't remember, but it was a very, you know, credible performance. And it was thanks to him. And I've often thought back on the kind of dedication that was there, you know, that in a way we took for granted, but when you look back on it, and you realize, you know, all the effort that was being made for a couple of students, it's quite incredible. And then the kind of, you know, patience that he showed with me, and the willingness to do all that work with me, when he could have easily said, well, you silly boy, you know, you got to this level without any Latin, so you just sink or swim. But that wasn't the attitude at all. So he always remains for me. I mean, I think a lot of students thought of him afterwards as the kind of stern disciplinarian and the demanding teacher. But I always had this singular view of him as this fantastically gentle, generous private tutor that I had, who helped me to get 5 years Latin.